Half an hour later, Judith saw a police car arrive at Stefan's property and a uniformed police officer get out. Judith tried as best she could to keep a monocular straight on him as he looked in through the windows of Stefan's house and took a wander through the garden. She wanted to bellow across the river that the man should jolly well look harder, but she bit her tongue. She had to believe that he knew what he was doing, and he'd find evidence of whatever it was that happened. However, after 20 minutes of what Judith could only describe as a cursory search, the police officer returned to his car, got in, and drove away. Was that it? The man had barely explored the garden, and he'd not even entered Stefan's house. Perhaps he'd gone to get reinforcements. At midnight, Judith discovered that there was no more whiskey in the decanter on the little table to her side. That was always a sign to go to bed. As she woozily ascended the heavy oak staircase, she found she had to hold on to the banister a bit more tightly than normal. Then she turned left to go to her bedroom when her bedroom was really on her right. But once she corrected her course via a brief tingle with a recalcitrant pedestra, she safely made her destination. Judith adored her bedroom. The wood panels were painted light green, and there was a majestic four-poster bed with a tapestry of a medieval hunting scene in its canopy. That the room was covered in old clothes, half-finished meals, and piles of discarded newspapers and magazines didn't bother her one jot. Judith never noticed the mess. In fact, she let it encompass her the same way that she let the river embrace her when she went swimming. The messier her bedroom, the more she felt cocooned and safe. The following morning, Judith was woken by the sound of the phone ringing. She reached for it, blearily seeing it had just gone 10 a.m. "Hello," she croaked. "Good morning," an efficient female voice said. "My name's Detective Sergeant Tanika Malik from the Maidenhead Police Department. I'm following up on the incident you reported at Mr. Dunwoody's property last night." Thank you for calling," Judith said, somewhat groggily. The detective sergeant explained that she'd sent a constable to inspect Mr. Dunwoody's home and garden. He'd not found anything of note. She was ringing to inform Judith that there was nothing to worry about. "But I know what I heard," Judith said. "Yes, the report said you heard a gunshot." "No, not just a gunshot. I heard someone call out something like, 'Hey, no,' and then I heard the gunshot. But I understand you were swimming in the river at the time." "Are you sure it was in fact a gunshot?" Judith was now fully awake and thoroughly irritated. "I grew up on a farm. I know what a gun sounds like. But what if it was something else? Like what? Well, for example, maybe it was a car backfiring?" This hadn't occurred to Judith. She thought for a moment before answering. "No, I'm sure I'd have known if it were a car. It was a gunshot. I take it this constable of yours reported that Stefan's car is still parked at his house. Why do you mention that?" "Because I presume Stefan didn't answer his phone when you called him, didn't he?" "No, I'm sorry, I can't quite follow your line of thought here. What phone call?" "You must have phoned him last night. I'm afraid I'm not allowed to share specific details with you, but a neighbor reports shooting at a house. Of course you phoned to check up on him, and the fact you haven't told me he answered suggests to me that he didn't answer. So seeing as his car was still in his driveway, well, that tells me something's up with him. After all, if you're at home, you answer your phone. If you're away, you take your car. At least someone who owned a car would. I don't." D.S. Malik didn't respond immediately. "You really thought this through," she eventually said. "It's all I could think about last night. I was so worried for Stefan. What if he's been shot and the gunman's escaped? In fact, what if Stefan is right now lying bleeding in a ditch? I don't think he's lying in a ditch. I'm sure there's something, a very innocent explanation for all of this. There wasn't any indication at his property that anything untoward had happened, and it's not that unusual for someone to ignore their phone. It's holiday season, people are away. I'm sure Mr. Dunwoody would turn up in the next few days. The moment he does, I'll let you know. Really, there's nothing to worry about." Malik ended the call by thanking Judy for being such a civic-minded neighbor and rung off. Afterwards, Judith lay in bed, not knowing what to do. Would D.S. Malik right? Was there in fact a far more innocent explanation for what she heard the night before? After all, Judith knew one thing for sure. Murders just didn't happen in Marlowe. She decided to put the matter from her mind and get on with her work for the day. When Judith had inherited her house from her great-aunt Betty in 1976, she'd received a portfolio of shares that provided her with a modest income, so she didn't have much to need to work for a living. But nothing would have ever made Judith give up her job. She loved it too much. Judith compiled crosswords for the national newspapers. She sat 2 or 3 a week, and the hours she spent each day working on the puzzles was a cherished refuge for her mind. When she was setting a crossword, calm descended on her, and she could lose herself for whole stretches of time as she carefully worked through all the pure mutations of a singularly, particularly satisfying anagram, or consider an elegant phrase or word which could be interpreted in more than one way. Judith crossed her drawing room to the card table by the bay window and smoothed down the green baize with her hand. Next, she reached up onto a shelf and pulled down a sheet of squared mathematical paper. She then chose a 2B pencil from a mug of 2B pencils, and even though it did need sharpening, she pushed the pencil into her metal desk sharpener. It gripped the end, the old electric motor clattering as it spun, and the pencil Judith removed a few seconds later wasn't so much a writing implement as a lethal weapon. Judith smiled to herself. A fresh pencil, the empty squares on the paper in front of her, the fight ahead. Sitting down, she picked up her wooden ruler and began to mark out a 15 by 15 grid of squares. Next, she shaded in a pattern of darker squares around a single line of symmetry, so each that a darker square had a twin reflected on the right. There wasn't any particular pattern she followed. It was mostly her many decades of experience that guided her hand. Once she had marked out her grid, all she had to do was fill in the blank spaces with words. This she knew would take her the next hour or so, and only once she was happy that she had an interesting collection of words intersecting with each other would she turn her mind to finally creating the clues. As for the types of clues she liked to set, she eschewed the willful opacity favored by many setters, most famously represented by the near-impossible monthly puzzle that used to appear in the Listener magazine. She felt there was something a bit too male about how they tried to show off how very clever they were. Look at me, they seemed to be saying. You'll never guess how brilliant I am. Instead, like many setters, she aligned herself with the principles of Ximenes, the legendary setter for the Observer paper from 1939 to 1972. Accordingly, her clues had to have two halves, a literal clue on one side, the riddle on the other, and the two halves had ultimately to play fair with the solver, with a small caveat that if a clue was ingenious or witty enough, she was prepared on occasion to break the rules. This morning, however, the muse wasn't with Judith. Having created her square of blocks and blanks, she couldn't settle on the correct word with which to fill the grid. She lacked all decisiveness. It was Stefan she knew. She couldn't concentrate. Shadja knew he was okay. Judith reached her tablet computer. She didn't much like the device, but it was useful for photographing and then emailing her crosswords on the papers. So she'd come to terms with it some years ago. She held it up to her face, but the stupid machine refused to unlock, claiming it didn't recognize her. Judith harumphed, once again cursing at the indignities of being an older woman. The modern world treated her as though she were entirely invisible, and even her own bloody computer criticized her for not looking suitably like herself. But there was no point trying to fight with technology. Judith had learned that a long time ago in an incident that had involved a strawberry-colored iMac and electric table that wasn't quite long enough, and a tripped accident and an emergency. Judith took a deep breath and composed herself. She held the tablet up and looked at it again. Nothing happened. Bloody thing, muttering to herself. Judith entered the passcode and then opened her web browser. Maybe there would be some news about Stefan in the last 24 hours. She typed Stefan Dunwoody into the search bar, but all of the hits told her he owned an art gallery called Dunwoody Arts in Marlow, a fact she already knew. But she wanted to be thorough, so she clicked through the pages of results. Although, what was this? One of the later results was a link to a webpage from a local newspaper, the Bucks Free Press. It was the headline that caught her attention. Bust up at Henley Regatta. Clicking the link, she found herself reading a diary piece from a roundup of the Henley Royal Regatta 6 weeks before. Word reaches us that Stefan Dunwoody, local art gallery owner, got into a tipsy dispute in the Royal Enclosure with Elliot Howard, owner of the Marlow Auction House. According to our little birdie, when Mr. Howard threatened to punch Mr. Dunwoody, the stewards were called and both men were forcibly ejected. Judith put her tablet down. So Stefan had gotten into a drunken altercation in Henley with someone called Elliot Howard, and here he was only a few short weeks later, and there had been another set to of some sort on his property. A set to where someone had fired a gun. And then Stefan had subsequently vanished. Sad Sought this for a game of soldiers, Judith thought as she strode across the room, swept up her cloak from its peg, and left the house. She went down to her boathouse, approached an old punt that was half in and half out of the water, and gave it a shove with her foot. She stepped up onto the back of it and grabbed the punting pole as the front of the boat bumped through the rotten boathouse doors and slipped out into the river. Despite her advanced years, Judith was an expert punter. With a flick of her wrist, she thrust the pole down into the riverbed, bent at the waist, and pushed with all her might. As the punt shot forward, she twisted the pole up and out of the soft mud, and the boat had the momentum to cross the river. Once she reached the further bank and the river was shallow again, it was no effort to punt upstream the 50 or so yards to Stefan's house. He used the prow of the punt to penetrate the wall of reeds that protected his riverbank and step up onto his land. She didn't need to secure the boats. Entirely surrounded by bulrushes, it wasn't going anywhere. Checking her watch, she could see that just over 8 minutes ago she'd been sitting in her house, and now here she was, at the sharp end of her neighbor's mysterious disappearance. Stefan's house was really rather splendid to Judith's mind. It was a converted water mill with a wooden wheel that turned lazily, but differently sized rectangular glass windows had subsequently been cut into the building. It was both pleasingly old-fashioned and modern at the same time. She went in and looked at Stefan's car in the driveway. Judith knew nothing about cars and cared even less, so all she could tell was that it was gray in color, and it was gleaming on a spot of dirt on it anywhere. She could see no other tire tracks in the gravel or any other clues that suggested that perhaps Stefan had left the house in a different vehicle. She went for a walk in the garden, trying to work out where the sound of the gunshot might have come from, but it was hard to place herself accurately where her only reference point was from a position in the river below the height of the bulrushes. In fact, it took only a few minutes of walking around and inspecting the reed bed by the riverbank for Judith to realize that she didn't even know what she was looking for. A drop of blood on the blade of grass, a muddy footprint. Judith looked at the wooden wheel turning on the side of the house and the mill pond in front of it. Despite the heat of the day, the water here was dark, and Judith shivered at the thought of it. There was something about still bodies of water that spooked her. Although as she looked, she could see that the water wasn't quite still. There was a slight current tugging at the surface. Where was the water going? Judith walked around the edge of the pond until she saw that it fed into a river that was about 10 feet across. Where the mill pot ended and the river began, there was a narrow brick causeway that crossed from one side of the garden to the other. Judith considered the river beyond the dam. It had to feed back into the Thames somehow, but it was hard to see exactly how Stefan had allowed this section of the garden to grow wild, and the water soon slipped under dense shrubs and bushes that crowded from both banks. With a sigh, Judith realized she'd have to follow the course of the river. She had to be thorough. So she pushed her way through the bushes, branches whipping her body, cobwebs sticking to her face, and ere she struggled to the other side. Once there, Judith was disappointed. It was even wilder in this corner of the garden, because she could see that the river passed through some iron bars into a concrete weir that fed the water back into the Thames. There was nothing of interest to use. Although as she regained her breath after exertion, she became aware of something in the air, a fetid smell like an old compost heap. Was it the river? She looked down at the water flowing through the grill. An old tree branch was half submerged, blocking the water, and leaves had backed up. But then Judith realized something. It wasn't a branch in the water, it was a human arm. It was reaching out of the water. The skin of the hand was as white as marble. And deeper still, Judith could just make out the body. It was Stefan Dunwoody, and in the center of his forehead was a small black hole. A bullet hole. Judith staggered back, her hand going to her neck. She'd been right all along. Stefan Dunwoody, her friend, her neighbor, had been shot dead.